The silence of the night sky is deceptive. Above the clouds, the world feels peaceful. Stars shimmer faintly, engines hum steadily, and passengers rest in quiet comfort. But what lies beyond that calm is often a reminder of how fragile human control truly is. Every journey into the skies begins with faith. Faith in the pilots, in the technology, in the unseen hands guiding the flight through invisible highways of air. Yet in the final minutes of some flights, that faith is tested in ways no one can predict. To begin with suspense is to take the audience into that moment. The thin slice of time where normal turns to nightmare, and silence becomes the loudest sound in the world. Imagine a flight cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign is off. Flight attendants move gracefully through the aisles, and passengers are drifting into light sleep. Outside, there's nothing but darkness and starlight. Suddenly, the aircraft jolts, just once, barely noticeable at first. A few passengers glance up, uncertain, then another jolt, stronger this time. A cup rattles, a bag falls. The calm voice of the captain comes over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're just experiencing a bit of turbulence." But deep inside the cockpit, the calm begins to crack. Instruments flicker. Warning lights blink. Confusion creeps in. The co-pilot's voice trembles slightly as he reports an anomaly. But there's no clear reason why it's happening. These are the moments, the final minutes, when every second counts and every decision echoes through history. Suspense isn't just about creating fear. It's about drawing the audience into a human experience where logic fights emotion. When we tell the story of the world's most mysterious plane crash, we must make the audience feel the weight of every heartbeat inside that cockpit. They must see the sweat forming on the pilot's brow, the shaking hands of the co-pilot as they struggle to interpret contradictory readings, the uncertainty of technology that was built to never fail yet suddenly stops making sense. To grab attention from the first moment, you must make the mystery feel alive, not distant, not historical, but immediate. The audience should feel as if they are there, watching it unfold, powerless to help but unable to look away. Suspense works because it touches something universal, the fear of the unknown. When a plane disappears, it's not just an aircraft vanishing, it's a part of our trust in modern safety evaporating with it. We live in a world where technology gives us comfort, where systems monitor every detail, and data flows endlessly to ensure our safety. Yet when the unexplainable happens, it shakes the very core of that trust. To open such a story, the words must capture that emotional collapse, the disbelief that something so advanced, so secure, could simply stop existing. It's not about beginning with tragedy. It's about beginning with tension, with the sound of uncertainty whispering through the static of a radio signal that suddenly cuts off. As a speaker or storyteller, the power lies in silence, the moment before revelation. Picture the audience, leaning forward, waiting for what comes next. The voice slows down, the tone deepens, and every word carries weight. In those final minutes, you might say, "The sky held its breath." That's how you pull them in, not with noise, but with the stillness before chaos. The audience doesn't just hear the story, they feel it. They imagine the pilot's confusion, the passenger's unawareness, the sudden drop of altitude, and the unseen hand of fate closing in. In a single breath, the story transforms from a routine flight to a fight for survival. The first moments of a speech or documentary determine whether the audience stays or drifts away. In aviation documentaries, especially those based on true events, suspense becomes the emotional engine. It bridges the gap between fact and feeling. Facts tell you what happened, suspense makes you experience it. When describing a mysterious crash, one might start with fragments. A lost radar signal, an incomplete message, an unexplained sound recorded in the black box. The audience begins to piece the puzzle together, but not all at once. Information should unfold slowly, layer by layer, as if you are walking them through a fog, where only parts of the truth are visible. Each layer deepens the intrigue and draws them closer to the emotional core of the story. In those first few minutes, the storyteller must build curiosity. Why did this happen? How could it happen? Who was responsible? What went wrong? The human mind naturally seeks answers, and suspense feeds that desire while delaying satisfaction. The key is not to give away too much, too soon. The narrative must hold something back, just like the sky holds its secrets. The audience should feel an emotional pull, a quiet discomfort that grows with every word. It's not about horror, it's about human vulnerability in the face of mystery. Every mysterious crash in aviation history has begun with the illusion of safety. That's where the suspense truly lives. In contrast, from comfort to chaos, from confidence to confusion, from control to collapse, the moment before the disaster is more powerful than the disaster itself. To grab the audience's attention, you must let them live in that moment. The calm before the storm, because it's there that their imagination fills in the blanks. Suspense is not built by shouting, it's built by whispering the truth slowly, allowing the fear to rise naturally within the listener's mind. Consider how many flights cross the skies each day. Thousands of aircraft, millions of passengers, all trusting that everything will go as planned. But one wrong reading, one frozen sensor, one miscommunication between man and machine, and that trust can shatter in seconds. That's what the audience must understand from the very first line, how fragile perfection can be. By beginning with suspense, we teach them not only about the mystery, but also about humanity's dependence on precision, and what happens when precision disappears. When writing or speaking about a mysterious crash, the opening should feel cinematic. The lights dim, the music fades, and a calm, deep voice says, "It was a routine flight, until it wasn't." That line alone creates a mental pause. It forces the audience to imagine the shift from peace to panic. In those few words, they sense that something terrible is coming, but they don't know what, how, or why. That's the power of suspense. It's not just the art of storytelling, it's the science of emotional timing. Every pause, every sound, every heartbeat must serve a purpose. Suspense also builds empathy. The audience doesn't just want to know what happened, they want to feel what it was like to be there. To imagine sitting on that plane, hearing a strange sound, seeing the crew whisper among themselves, sensing something isn't right. The storyteller's job is to make that invisible fear visible. Through tone, rhythm, and imagery, you transform facts into feelings. You give emotion to data and meaning to mystery. The suspenseful opening must also connect to reality. People must know this isn't fiction, it's real. Lives were lost, families were changed forever, and the truth still hides somewhere in the wreckage. By grounding suspense in authenticity, you turn curiosity into concern. The audience doesn't just watch, they care. They begin to search for answers alongside you. That's what makes the first keynote so essential. Because without emotional connection, the story becomes just another report. Suspense in such stories often begins with sound, the static of a fading signal, the faint beep of a warning alarm, the captain's calm voice trying to mask tension. These elements create atmosphere, a sense of unease that grows silently. It's the moment between two breaths, where life and death balance on the edge of uncertainty. The world outside may still look peaceful, but inside the cockpit chaos begins to bloom like a silent storm. That duality, the peace outside, the panic inside, is what keeps the audience glued to every word. To hold that attention, the opening must also build layers of anticipation. The storyteller should reveal just enough to make the audience think they understand, then twist their expectations. The mystery should deepen with each detail. The aircraft sent no distress signal. Radar contact was lost. The wreckage was found hundreds of miles from the flight path. Each of these statements adds weight, confusion, and curiosity. They create a rhythm, a heartbeat of revelation and restraint. What makes the suspense truly powerful is its emotional honesty. You're not just telling a story of failure. You're telling a story of human courage against impossible odds. In those final minutes, Pilots fight not only with malfunctioning instruments, but also with their own fear. Their voices on the black box recordings are not characters, they're real people trying to save lives. The opening must honor that reality. Suspense isn't about dramatizing tragedy, it's about respecting it while showing how unpredictable the human experience can be. Every sentence should feel alive, pulsing with both information and emotion. The tone must shift smoothly, from calm narration to tightening tension, from descriptive imagery to raw human reflection. The listener should feel pulled deeper, step by step, into the unfolding nightmare. And yet, amid that fear, there must also be admiration, the quiet acknowledgement of the crew's composure, their humanity, their refusal to give up even as everything around them falls apart. Suspense must also extend beyond the event itself. It should echo into the investigation that follows. As the narrator describes the discovery of debris, the retrieval of black boxes, and the search for answers, the same emotional tension lingers. Each new finding should bring a hint of revelation and a shadow of doubt. Was this truly an accident, or something more complex? Did the pilots make an error, or was the system itself to blame? These questions must hover unanswered, creating an intellectual and emotional loop that keeps the audience engaged long after the introduction ends. Finally, the suspenseful opening must mirror the fragility of life. Every crash, every final minute, is a reminder of how quickly normal can vanish. Suspense connects that reality to the audience's own fears, the fear of losing control, of trusting something unseen, of facing the unknown. By awakening that universal vulnerability, the story becomes more than a report, it becomes a mirror. The audience sees themselves in the silence of that cockpit, in the blinking red light, in the unanswered call from air traffic control. And when the final line of that opening is spoken, perhaps a simple statement like, "Then, the world lost contact," the silence that follows is more powerful than any explosion, any scream, any chaos. That's the heart of suspense. It's the art of making the audience listen to silence, feel the absence, and fear what they cannot see. That is how a storyteller grips the audience from the very first breath. By taking them into the darkness, letting them sense the fear that no one could explain, and leaving them wanting to know what happened next. Because suspense, at its core, is not just about fear of death. It's about the hunger for truth, the need to understand what lies within those final minutes that changed everything. When suspense begins to unfold, it doesn't erupt. It creeps in quietly. It's the hum of the engines fading into the distance of the human mind. It's the moment when technology becomes silent and instinct takes over. As the mysterious flight continues into the night, the audience must sense that shift, that subtle change from order to chaos. The goal of every storyteller, every documentary narrator, is to let that transformation breathe naturally, to allow tension to grow like an unseen shadow crawling across the cockpit walls. Suspense deepens not when everything happens at once, but when the unknown expands. The pilots glance at each other. Their eyes tell more than their voices ever could. "Something's wrong," one says softly, though every light still shines green. The co-pilot checks the instruments again, disbelief flickering in his voice. The readings don't match, they can't be right. The calm in his tone is forced, rehearsed, part of the discipline of flight. But beneath that calm is fear, not the fear of death, but the fear of losing control. And as the narrator's voice rolls over this moment, the audience leans forward. Suspense has done its work. They're no longer hearing a story, they're inside it. Suspense must linger in rhythm. The voice rises and falls like turbulence itself. A pause here, a breath there, moments of silence that speak louder than any word. Because in that silence, the audience hears everything: the beep of alarms, the rush of wind, the whisper of fate moving closer. The tone must make them forget where they are. It must transport them into that dark cabin where every second stretches into eternity. The secret of suspense is restraint. To build it, the storyteller must resist the urge to explain too soon. A mysterious crash loses its power when all the answers come at once. The audience needs time to absorb uncertainty, to feel it pressing down on them. Just as investigators spend months unraveling the truth, the listener must experience that same slow revelation. Suspense thrives on what's hidden, on what's left unsaid. Imagine the narrator saying softly, "Radar contact lost at 2:14 a.m., then silence, nothing else." The pause that follows is the heartbeat of suspense. The audience waits for the next word, but it doesn't come, not yet. That gap of silence makes the story alive, forcing minds to fill it with questions. Did it explode? Did it vanish? Were there survivors? Suspense feeds on the human imagination, and imagination always paints the darkest picture first. In the world of aviation storytelling, the art of suspense isn't just about creating fear. It's about guiding empathy. Each second that passes without an answer makes the audience care more deeply. They think of the passengers who might have been sleeping peacefully, the parents returning home, the children with dreams waiting below. Suspense humanizes data. It gives heartbeats to numbers and tears to timelines. The longer the truth stays just out of reach, the more meaningful it becomes when it's finally revealed. That's why the opening of any mysterious crash story should stretch time itself. 5 real-world seconds can last an entire minute in the audience's imagination. Every blink feels slower, every word heavier. That emotional time dilation creates memory. People forget statistics, but they never forget how a story made them feel. Suspense is the bridge between fact and faith. It asks the audience to believe in the storyteller long enough to journey into the unknown. In a speech or documentary, that trust is sacred. The voice must feel honest, not manipulative. The tone of someone who knows the facts, but still feels the pain of not understanding them fully. When describing the crash, use phrases that sound like confession. We still don't know what truly happened that night. What we found only deepened the mystery. Such statements are not weaknesses, they are emotional truth. They remind the audience that even science has limits, and within those limits, human hearts still ache for meaning. As the narrative moves forward, suspense transforms from fear into reflection. The audience, once tense and uncertain, begins to feel curiosity taking shape. They want to know what caused this silence in the sky. The storyteller must balance this curiosity carefully, feeding it piece by piece. Reveal a clue, a fragment of fuselage found miles away, a strange data spike in the final transmission, a sound from the black box that no one can explain. Each clue should open a door, not close it. Suspense is not a destination. It's a journey through shadows where light flickers but never stays still. To keep the audience emotionally invested, the suspense must evolve. At first it's shock, then confusion, then empathy, and finally introspection. By the middle of the narrative, the audience isn't just wondering what happened. They're asking why. They're thinking of how fragile life is, how easily routine becomes catastrophe. That's when suspense becomes philosophy, when a story about a plane turns into a story about all of us. In those last recorded minutes, the pilots' voices might tremble but never break. "Pull up." "I'm trying." It's not responding. These aren't lines from a movie, they're echoes of real courage. Suspense must honor them by letting their humanity shine through the chaos. When the audience hears those final exchanges, the fear they feel is mixed with admiration. They realize these were professionals doing everything right, and still, fate slipped through the cracks. That duality, skill against uncertainty, is what makes aviation mysteries unforgettable. The suspense in such storytelling must never feel forced. It must arise from truth, from the contrast between confidence and collapse. 1 minute the flight is normal, the next it's gone. The storyteller's job is to make that shift feel natural, inevitable, yet shocking. To do that, sensory detail becomes essential. Describe the dim lights of the cockpit, the faint reflection on the glass, the hum of instruments, the blinking of warning icons that no one had ever seen before. The more real it feels, the more the audience's imagination grips the edge of belief. Suspense is also about pacing. The rhythm of sentences should mimic the rhythm of panic, short bursts followed by long pauses, altitude dropping. No response. Try again. Each phrase cuts like wind, sharp and unpredictable. The pauses between them become emotional echoes, spaces where the audience's own heartbeat fills the silence. In those gaps, they sense the magnitude of what's happening, not through explanation, but through experience. To sustain suspense through an entire segment, contrast must be your greatest ally. Move between moments of stillness and sudden revelation. Let the audience breathe. Then take that breath away again. For instance, describe how investigators thought they had solved the case, only to uncover evidence that shattered every theory. What they found, the narrator might say, was something no one could have imagined. Then stop. Let silence finish the sentence. That's how you make every word count. As the story progresses, suspense becomes emotional gravity. It keeps the listener from drifting away. The investigation scenes should echo the same unease as the crash itself. Picture the experts hunched over black boxes, headphones pressed tight, listening to distorted recordings, hours of static. Then one sound, one voice, one unexplained noise. The suspense returns. Even on the ground, the mystery still breathes. By this point, the audience realizes suspense isn't just an opening trick. It's the heartbeat of the entire story. Every unanswered question, every uncertain clue, every contradiction between reports keeps the narrative alive. The deeper the mystery, the stronger the engagement. But there's a delicate balance: too much uncertainty, and the audience feels lost; too much explanation, and they lose curiosity. The storyteller must dance along that line, always keeping just enough darkness for the imagination to wander. Suspense also serves a moral purpose. It reminds us of humility, that no matter how advanced our machines become, we remain vulnerable to the unknown. Every crash, every mystery is a lesson carved in the sky. Suspense delivers that lesson gently, allowing the audience to discover it themselves. When they realize that human error, nature, and fate often intertwine beyond our understanding, the fear they feel turns into respect. Respect for those who fly, those who investigate, and those who seek truth even in tragedy. Toward the end of the narrative, suspense reaches its most powerful form: silence mixed with realization. The wreckage has been found, the black boxes recovered, but answers still feel incomplete. This, the narrator says softly, was not just a crash. It was a question that the sky itself refused to answer. The audience exhales, but not in relief, in contemplation. Suspense doesn't end with revelation, it ends with meaning. At this point, suspense becomes reflection. The viewers look inward. They think of their own flights, their own fragile trust in the systems around them. They remember the feeling of takeoff, the beauty of clouds, the serenity of flight, and now they understand that beneath that serenity lies constant vigilance. The final minutes of that mysterious flight now represent something larger: the eternal tension between control and chaos, knowledge and mystery. Even after the credits roll or the speech ends, true suspense lingers. It stays in the mind like an echo. People replay moments: the voice of the captain, the fading radar, the final silence. They talk about it, search for theories, feel the weight of uncertainty. That's when you know suspense has succeeded, when the story refuses to let go. And yet, suspense is not cruelty. It's compassion in disguise. By holding the audience in uncertainty, you make them care deeply. You make them imagine the lives involved, the bravery, the loss, and the humanity behind the event. The unknown becomes personal. Suspense transforms mystery into empathy. So as the final moments of the story approach, the voice slows again. In those last seconds, it whispers, "They were still fighting." That line closes the circle. The audience feels the chill, the admiration, the sorrow. Suspense has taken them from curiosity to emotion, from confusion to connection. Every great aviation mystery begins this way, not with fire or wreckage, but with silence, stillness, and questions. The first keynote, "Begin with suspense," isn't just advice. It's the soul of storytelling itself. Because in suspense lies truth, that life is unpredictable, that every ending hides a story, and that sometimes the most powerful sound in the world is the one that's never heard. When the lights fade and the narrator's voice dissolves into the quiet, the audience remains suspended, not in fear, but in wonder. They've journeyed through uncertainty and returned with understanding. Suspense has done its job. It has turned a mysterious plane crash into a mirror of humanity's eternal search for answers. And as the last image fades, an aircraft gliding peacefully through an endless sky, one thought remains: even in our most advanced moments, we are still children of mystery, guided not by certainty, but by hope. The tone of emotion begins where suspense ends. After the quiet shock of the unknown, what remains is feeling, the heartbeat behind every unexplained second. To use emotional tone is not simply to describe, it is to translate silence into sensation. When a plane vanishes from radar, the sky is not empty, it's full of echoes, voices, memories, questions that will never be answered. The audience must feel those echoes vibrating inside them. Facts can tell what happened. Emotion tells why it matters. In the story of the world's most mysterious plane crash, emotion begins with confusion. The confusion of those final minutes, when the pilot's words trip over each other, when alarms sound without reason, when training meets chaos. The narrator's voice must capture that confusion, not by shouting, but by trembling. It must sound as if the speaker, too, is searching for meaning. What happened in those final moments? The voice asks softly. How could everything disappear so quickly? The audience feels that uncertainty. They feel the helplessness of not knowing. Confusion becomes contagious. The emotion deepens through contrast. Before disaster, there was calm, families boarding happily, laughter in the cabin, routine announcements echoing through the speakers. The storyteller must let the audience live in that normalcy long enough to care about it. Because only when peace feels real can fear strike with truth. The moment the engines roar and the plane lifts into the clouds, a sense of security fills the air, and that's exactly what must be emotionally shattered later. The fear doesn't arrive with noise, it arrives with absence, a signal lost, a voice cut short, a sentence that ends mid-word. Emotion also lives in small details: a child's toy left on a seat, a text message never sent, a pilot's last breath as he fights against a machine that no longer obeys him. When the documentary voice mentions these fragments, the listener's imagination does the rest. They picture the faces, the gestures, the unreal calm before the storm. Emotional tone doesn't tell the audience to cry, it gives them reasons to feel. It gives human weight to mechanical failure. To make the audience feel confusion, the narration must move like confusion itself, rising, falling, breaking, reforming. The sentences can shorten suddenly, as if gasping for air, altitude dropping, controls locked, no response. Then a pause, a silence that says more than paragraphs ever could. The human mind fills that silence with fear. The documentary voice can slow, lower, become fragile. They did everything right, it says, and yet nothing worked. That line carries both tragedy and admiration. It respects the human struggle within the machinery of fate. Fear in this context is not horror, it's empathy. It's the realization that even experts, even those trained for every possible scenario, can face the impossible. The emotional tone must remind the audience that the pilots were not symbols. They were people, living through unimaginable pressure in real time. Every instruction, every reaction, every heartbeat mattered. The listener should feel the tightness in their chest, the sense of being trapped inside that cockpit where warning lights bloom like red stars across the panels. As the fear grows, the narrator must also embody restraint. Too much emotion becomes noise, too little becomes numbness. The perfect tone wavers on the edge of control, like the pilots themselves. When describing the chaos, the voice can crack slightly, almost as if reliving it. They tried again, and again, the nose wouldn't lift. The instruments betrayed them. Each phrase lands heavy, leaving behind a trail of despair. Yet beneath that despair runs courage, the refusal to give up. That duality is where true emotion lives. Confusion also extends to the world below. Families waiting for updates, news anchors repeating fragments of information, search teams unsure where to begin. The emotional tone must shift from the claustrophobic fear inside the plane to the wide, aching silence of those who wait. Hours passed. The voice might say, and there was no word. That sentence alone can freeze a room. The emotion is not in the words but in the emptiness between them. The audience begins to feel what the families felt, disbelief turning into dread, hope flickering against reality. In emotional storytelling, rhythm is everything. Long, slow sentences create reflection. Short, sharp ones mimic panic. When the pilots shout commands, the narration should tighten, cutting fast, almost breathless. When describing the aftermath, it should slow, allowing sorrow to settle like dust. The music beneath, if there is any, should pulse quietly, heartbeat soft. Emotion should guide every sensory detail. A trembling voice, a distant siren, the sound of waves against debris. Each sound becomes part of the feeling. To make the audience truly feel the mystery, the narration must step beyond the technical and enter the philosophical. Why do some answers never come? The voice asks. Why does the truth sink deeper the harder we search? These are not just questions about aviation, they are questions about existence. When a story touches that level, emotion turns universal. Everyone listening recognizes the sensation of searching for meaning where none is found. That recognition binds them to the story. The emotional tone should also reflect respect, respect for those who lived the event, and those who lost their lives. The narrator's voice must never exploit tragedy, it must honor it. It should sound like remembrance, not performance. They were mothers, fathers, children, it whispers. They trusted the sky. That trust is what makes the loss so heavy. The emotional tone transforms statistics into souls, reminding us that behind every flight number lies a human story. Confusion, fear, and mystery intertwine like currents in a storm. The audience should not merely understand them, they should drift inside them. At one moment, they feel the panic of the cockpit, at another, the aching stillness of the ocean floor where the wreckage lies. Emotion paints both scenes with the same brush. One chaotic, one hauntingly calm. The mystery becomes a living presence, something that breathes between the words. The storyteller doesn't need to explain it, they need only let it linger. Emotion can also come through perspective. Imagine shifting from the pilot's eyes to the passenger's seat to the investigator's desk. Each perspective carries its own flavor of confusion. For the pilot, it's disbelief. For the passenger, it's sudden terror. For the investigator, it's obsession. The narration can flow between these viewpoints seamlessly, weaving a fabric of shared humanity. The emotional tone keeps them connected. The confusion of one mirrors the confusion of another. In the world of aviation disasters, mystery often overshadows fact, but emotion brings balance. It reminds the audience that while machines fail, emotions endure. The fear in the cockpit becomes the determination in the control room, the sorrow of families, the resolve of search teams. Every layer of emotion expands the story's depth. Without it, the crash would remain just an event. With it, it becomes a human epic. Emotion also lives in repetition. When a phrase repeats, it becomes a heartbeat. They searched, and searched, and searched. Each repetition adds weight, desperation, persistence. The audience begins to breathe in that rhythm. Repetition in emotional tone mirrors the endless cycle of hope and despair that defines such mysteries. As the story unfolds, the emotional tone must evolve. The initial fear of the unknown gives way to the sorrow of loss, then to the quiet awe of mystery. The narrator can guide this evolution through subtle shifts in voice, beginning with tension, moving into grief, and ending with wonder. Perhaps, the voice might say, some answers are not meant for us to find. That line carries humility, a soft acceptance that emotion has nowhere else to go but inward. To create confusion authentically, the narration must sometimes contradict itself, just as real events do. One theory says one thing, another something else. The storyteller should present both with equal weight, letting the audience feel the uncertainty of truth. The tone should neither confirm nor deny, it should hover, unresolved. This emotional neutrality enhances the mystery. The listener experiences what investigators experience, the frustration of almost knowing. The emotional tone also shapes imagery. The ocean becomes more than water, it becomes memory. The sky becomes more than atmosphere, it becomes witness. When emotion guides description, objects turn symbolic. A torn wing represents fragility. A recovered watch frozen at a specific time symbolizes the last heartbeat. These images stay with the audience long after words fade. To maintain connection, the speaker's emotional honesty must remain visible. When the narrator pauses, the audience should sense real breath, not scripted silence. Authenticity breaks barriers. If the voice quivers slightly, if it hesitates before a painful detail, that vulnerability invites empathy. The audience no longer listens to a story, they share it. Every mystery carries within it a mirror of the human condition. That's where emotion finds its deepest root. Fear of loss, confusion over meaning, longing for closure, these are universal feelings. The emotional tone turns the plane crash from a historical event into a meditation on existence. "We build machines to master the skies," the narrator says quietly, "but we can never master fate." That single sentence holds sadness, wisdom, and humility all at once. Emotion also requires pacing of revelation. Too much too soon dulls impact, too little leaves emptiness. Each new fact should feel like a wound reopening. The narrator reveals a recovered recorder, a decoded voice, a final message. "It was the captain," they say. His last words were, "We're losing it." The line lands like a heartbeat stopping. The audience doesn't need to be told to feel, they already do. As the documentary voice continues, the emotional tone must echo through setting. The endless search ships, the sleepless investigators, the maps marked with circles and crosses, all become part of a larger emotion persistence. Even in grief, humanity keeps searching. That persistence is the counter melody to fear. It gives hope a place to live within the sadness. In using emotional tone, balance is everything. Too much despair can numb the audience. Too much comfort can betray the truth. The best tone walks the line, painful yet purposeful. It lets the audience sense tragedy but also resilience. Because emotion, when honest, does not end in darkness, it leads toward understanding. And when the first part of this emotional journey nears its pause, the listener realizes they have not just learned about a crash, they have felt it. The confusion of technology failing, the fear of silence in the cockpit, the mystery of what still lies unanswered, all have settled inside them like echoes. The emotional tone has bridged time, distance, and reason. It has made the unimaginable real. The hours that followed the crash became a silence that wrapped around the world like a shroud. For families waiting at the arrival gate, that silence was unbearable. They looked at the clocks, checked their phones, and listened for updates that never came. Every second that passed without news became a scream buried inside their hearts. Reporters began to gather, whispering questions no one could answer. The airline staff avoided eye contact, their faces pale, their words rehearsed but trembling. The emotional tone of that night wasn't made of words. It was built from disbelief, confusion, and an ache that reached across oceans. When investigators finally spoke, their voices carried both authority and exhaustion. They tried to explain the unexplainable, to calm the storm of emotions with logic and procedure. But in the human heart, logic often finds no place when grief is fresh. Families wanted to know what happened, why it happened, and who was responsible. Each official statement was met with tears, anger, and denial. In that emotional chaos, it wasn't just the plane that had disappeared, it was trust itself. The air traffic controllers replayed the radar screen again and again, staring at the point where the signal had faded. It was as if the aircraft had been swallowed by the sky. One controller, who had guided the flight for hours, later confessed that he felt a personal guilt that words couldn't express. I watched it vanish," he said softly, "and I couldn't bring them back." That confession, simple and raw, reflected the emotional depth of every person involved. Behind the monitors and uniforms were humans who carried the weight of invisible ghosts. The tone of confusion extended to the investigators themselves. They were professionals, trained for logic, but even they struggled to process what they were uncovering. The black boxes arrived covered in salt and memory, fragments of a story that demanded to be told. As they listened to the final minutes, the room fell into silence. The voices of the pilots echoed through the speakers, steady, calm, then suddenly filled with alarm. Each word became a haunting melody of courage and despair. The investigators didn't just hear the sounds, they felt them. They could sense the pulse of fear, the exhaustion, and the will to fight until the end. That is the moment where emotion and evidence merge. The moment where data becomes human. Across television screens, the world mourned. Documentaries, news clips, and interviews began to appear. Every voice carried emotion, pilots explaining how such events could occur, families describing who their loved ones were, psychologists talking about collective grief. Yet beyond all these analyses was something deeper, a shared vulnerability. People realized that even in an age of technology and precision, we are still fragile travelers in an unpredictable sky. That fear, subtle yet powerful, changed the way millions of people viewed flying. In one of the documentaries, a survivor from a connecting flight, a man who was supposed to be on the doomed aircraft, but missed it by minutes, spoke with a trembling voice. He said, "I keep thinking, why me? Why not me?" His words cut through all the technical details and spoke to the emotional heart of the tragedy. They reminded the audience that fate is both mysterious and merciless. The emotional tone of such stories becomes the soul of every great mystery. It transforms numbers and reports into something deeply human. As weeks passed, the memorials began. Families gathered in quiet halls, lighting candles, holding photographs that once smiled back at them. The investigators stood at the back, humbled by the faces of those they represented in reports and charts. The words spoken at those ceremonies were filled with emotion, gratitude for lives lost, sorrow for unanswered questions, and hope that such a thing would never happen again. When a child placed a single white flower near the memorial wall, the world seemed to pause. That flower was not just a symbol of grief, it was a whisper of love that defied death. The media's emotional tone also evolved. At first, it was sensational. Questions shouted, images repeated, theories thrown around. But as more details emerged, a softer tone took over. Documentaries began to focus on the people, the crew who fought until the end, the families left behind, the rescuers who combed through debris with trembling hands. These stories gave life to the tragedy, allowing audiences to feel rather than just know. Because in the end, emotion is what connects us all. It bridges the gap between the sky and the ground, between reason and grief. Inside the investigation rooms, emotions ran quietly beneath the surface. Engineers argued, data analysts replayed simulations, pilots debated control responses. Yet every late-night discussion carried an unspoken pain. They weren't just solving a puzzle. They were trying to give peace to hundreds of souls. At moments, one could see an investigator pause, take a deep breath, and close their eyes, as if haunted by the voices from the cockpit recordings. Even those hardened by years of experience couldn't escape the emotional gravity of this case. For the pilots' families, the world became a blur of sympathy and suspicion. Some saw their loved ones as heroes who fought until the final second, others faced harsh speculation and blame. The emotional burden of that contradiction was immense. One widow later said in an interview, "They called him a professional one day and careless the next. But I know what kind of man he was. He would never stop fighting for those passengers." Her trembling voice became an echo that spread through countless hearts watching from their homes. Even among the passengers' families, emotions varied in unimaginable ways. Some found solace in faith, others in anger, others in silence. One father spent every evening near the sea, staring at the horizon where the flight was last known to be. He said, "It's the only place I still feel close to her. That kind of pain cannot be quantified. It exists beyond logic, beyond data. It is the living heartbeat of every mystery that refuses to be solved." As time went on, the emotional tone of the public shifted from grief to reflection. The crash became a lesson, an emblem of the delicate balance between human skill and machine reliance. The story was told in classrooms, in documentaries, and on anniversary broadcasts. But even after years, the emotion remained. When survivors and families gathered again to mark another year, the same tears flowed. Because the mystery wasn't just about a plane, it was about how deeply humans feel when the unthinkable happens. Psychologists studying the tragedy found something remarkable. Shared grief had created a global empathy network. Strangers who had never met before sent letters, comforted each other online, and even formed support groups. It was as if the entire world had silently agreed to hold the sorrow together. That collective emotion gave rise to a new way of remembering tragedies, not as isolated events, but as shared human experiences that connect us beyond boundaries. Years later, when filmmakers revisited the story for a new documentary, the emotional tone remained raw. The narrator spoke in hushed, heavy tones. The music swelled gently under the voice, guiding the audience through sadness, wonder, and hope. The emotional tone wasn't just about tears, it was about awe. Awe for the courage shown, awe for the mystery that still lingered, and awe for the human heart that continues to search for meaning in loss. Behind the scenes, editors chose every image carefully: a child's shoe found in the wreckage, a cracked watch frozen at the time of impact, a photo of smiling passengers before boarding. These visuals, paired with emotional narration, pulled audiences into the story in a way that facts alone never could. This is where emotional tone transforms storytelling. It makes tragedy universal. No matter where you are from, you can feel the same chill, the same heartbreak, the same quiet empathy. Some critics argued that documentaries like these romanticized tragedy, but others believed they served a deeper purpose. They humanized the headlines. They turned statistics into people. And that is what the emotional keynote truly means. To let the audience not just learn about the crash, but feel its impact in their souls, because feeling is what keeps memory alive. One of the final scenes of the documentary showed an investigator standing near the memorial site years later. The camera captured the wind rustling through the names engraved on stone. He whispered, "We learned a lot from this crash, but we also learned how fragile we all are." That single sentence carried the entire emotional essence of the story. It was not about machines or data, it was about humanity confronting its own limits. The emotional resonance of The Final Minutes endures because it speaks to something deeper than aviation. It speaks to our fear of the unknown, our respect for courage, and our desperate need for closure. Every viewer, regardless of background, feels a sense of connection to those final moments, as though they too were there in that cockpit, holding on through the chaos, praying for one more second of life. That shared emotional immersion transforms the tragedy into a collective human memory. In the end, the confusion, fear, and mystery surrounding the crash are not just part of the story, they are the story. They are what make it unforgettable. The confusion mirrors the human mind trying to find meaning in chaos. The fear mirrors our instinctive response to danger and loss. And the mystery mirrors life itself. A journey where not everything can be explained. To make the audience feel all of this is the power of emotional tone. It's what turns a factual report into an unforgettable experience, what makes a documentary not just watched but felt. As the final music fades and the screen turns black, what remains isn't data, it's emotion. The faces of the lost linger in the viewer's mind, the sound of the ocean seems louder, and the silence feels heavier. That is the mark of emotional storytelling done right. It reminds the world that even in tragedy, there is a pulse, a human pulse, that continues to beat beneath the layers of mystery and time. And so, as the credits roll, the audience sits in silence, not out of confusion, but reverence. They've witnessed more than a crash. They've felt the heartbeat of a story that refuses to fade. Because the emotional tone is not just part of the narrative, it is the narrative. It carries the soul of the final minutes, whispering to every listener that behind every mystery lies humanity itself, waiting to be felt, remembered, and never forgotten. The ocean was calm that morning when the search teams began their work. The surface shimmered beneath a rising sun, but beneath that calmness lay the graveyard of questions the world was desperate to answer. Ships moved slowly, tracing the last known coordinates of the flight. Sonar scanners swept the depths, sending out pulses of sound that vanished into a void. Every beep, every echo that returned, felt like a heartbeat of the mystery itself. These were not just machines searching for debris. They were instruments of hope, driven by human hearts that refused to give up. Days turned into weeks, and still the ocean kept its secrets. But slowly, fragments began to appear, pieces of fuselage, torn seats, a single child's shoe. These weren't just pieces of metal, they were silent witnesses, each one holding a story that ended too soon. The investigators, though trained to remain detached, couldn't help but feel the emotional weight of every discovery. The facts they uncovered weren't sterile lines in a report, they were the final chapters of human lives. When the flight data recorder was finally found, there was a collective sigh across the search fleet. It was as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Inside that small orange box lay the last conversation between man and machine, the final proof of what truly happened in those desperate minutes. But even as the box was opened, emotions flooded the room. The engineers and technicians worked silently, aware that they were about to hear voices that hadn't spoken since the sky itself fell silent. The first playback was almost unbearable. The pilots' voices filled the speakers, calm at first, methodical, professional. Then came the confusion, instrument readings that didn't make sense, alarms that contradicted one another. You could hear the tremor in their voices as they fought to understand what was happening. Check speed. Altitude dropping. No, that can't be right. Then, overlapping voices, one command interrupting another. The facts were clear. A sudden system failure had created chaos in the cockpit, but the emotion was what made the story real. Behind every command was fear. Behind every decision was courage. When investigators analyzed the data, they found patterns that aligned perfectly with known technical issues. Ice crystals forming at high altitude had likely caused sensors to give false readings. The autopilot disengaged, forcing the pilots to take control manually. In those final moments, the aircraft was caught between technology's brilliance and its limitations. The facts painted a clear picture of sequence, but not of meaning. For meaning, one had to look deeper into the human reaction. The captain had logged over 15,000 flight hours, a man known for calm precision and mentorship. His co-pilot was younger, eager, skilled, but less experienced with such sudden failures. As they battled to regain control, their training collided with the unpredictability of human instinct. Every pilot knows the textbook response, but in chaos, instinct often overrides protocol. It was this dance between fact and feeling that made the event both tragic and profoundly human. Investigators reconstructed the flight second by second. They plotted graphs, cross-checked data, recreated simulations. On screens filled with numbers and trajectories, the flight path resembled a trembling heartbeat. It rose and fell, spiraling as if the aircraft itself was alive, struggling to survive. One investigator later said, "When we replayed the data, it felt like we were watching someone drown in slow motion." The statement wasn't scientific, but it was true. Facts described the descent, emotion revealed its agony. Outside the investigation rooms, families waited. They were told about sensor failures, about flight dynamics and weather anomalies. But for them, the only fact that mattered was this: their loved ones were gone. And yet, even in their grief, some found a strange comfort in knowing what had happened. Truth, no matter how painful, became a form of healing. It was the emotional bridge between despair and acceptance. In the documentaries that followed, directors sought to merge these two worlds, the world of evidence and the world of emotion. The narration spoke of a sequence of errors, but the images showed wedding rings found in the wreckage, children's drawings among the debris. The facts made it real, but the emotion made it unforgettable. The combination of both created something more powerful than either could alone. It created connection. Pilots watching the investigation unfold saw both caution and courage in the cockpit recordings. Many admitted that in similar circumstances, they might have made the same choices. That realization struck deeply. It wasn't about blame, it was about empathy. The line between error and impossibility is thinner than most can imagine. To blend facts with emotion is to acknowledge that even in science, humanity bleeds through the data. The technical reports concluded that the accident was preventable. If only certain systems had been updated, if only warnings had been clearer. But if only became a ghostly refrain in every press conference, haunting both the airline and the families. The facts were now official, signed and sealed in documents. Yet, what lingered was something the reports could never quantify: the sound of voices fading into static, the courage of hands steady on controls, the collective heartbeat of passengers who never knew what was coming. Years later, when the full documentary was released, it carried the tagline, "The sky doesn't forgive mistakes, it records them." The narrator's voice, deep and haunting, described every technical detail with precision, yet every word was laced with compassion. It explained the malfunction, but also honored the human effort to overcome it. Viewers could understand the physics, but they could also feel the heartbreak. That's the essence of blending fact with emotion. It transforms knowledge into empathy. In one scene, the documentary paused on a slow, motion shot of the recovered flight recorder being lifted from the sea. The narrator whispered, "This small box holds the truth." But truth here is not enough. The music swelled, and for a moment, the audience could sense the weight of truth itself. Heavy, fragile, incomplete. The facts told what happened, the emotion told why it mattered. Even in classrooms where the crash is now studied as a case in aviation safety, instructors emphasize this balance. They tell students, data shows the event, emotion teaches the lesson. Because numbers can reveal failure, but only empathy can prevent it from happening again. Pilots learn from simulations, but they also learn from the emotion embedded in those final words: the calmness, the confusion, the fight. Those sounds become eternal reminders that behind every button and every light sits a human soul, making split-second decisions in the face of fear. For families, anniversaries became moments of quiet reflection. Some returned to the memorial site, touching engraved names, whispering words to the wind. Others stayed home, replaying the documentaries, watching the faces of their loved ones in old videos. They could recite the technical explanation by heart, yet it never made the loss any easier. Because facts can explain a moment, but only emotion can explain the meaning of that moment. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized how thin the boundary was between cause and chance. A frozen sensor, a delayed response, a misunderstood alert. Individually small but together catastrophic. The facts were undeniable, but so was the humanity behind them. The co-pilot's final words, simple, terrified, defiant, became the emotional heartbeat of the entire story. He wasn't just part of an accident report, he was a symbol of humanity facing the unimaginable. The documentaries did not shy away from this balance. Each moment of analysis was paired with silence, each technical diagram followed by the sound of the ocean or a shot of the endless sky. This rhythm mirrored the real heartbeat of the investigation, logic and loss, side by side. To blend these two is not manipulation, it is truth told through empathy. For the scientists, the tragedy was a lesson in precision. For the world, it was a lesson in humility. The more technology advances, the more fragile we realize we are. Machines obey data, but humans live in emotion. And in that cockpit, those two worlds collided. The facts of what went wrong were undeniable, but the emotion of how it felt to be there, to fight the impossible, was something only imagination can grasp. As the investigation closed, the lead investigator addressed the press one final time. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. "We have our findings," he said, "but we also have our reminders. Every system has limits. Every human has courage. And sometimes, even when both do everything right, fate has other plans." The world listened in silence. In that moment, fact and emotion became one truth. When the documentary ended, viewers didn't just walk away informed. They walked away moved. They didn't just understand what went wrong, they felt what it meant. That's the power of blending facts with emotion. It transforms tragedy into memory, and memory into meaning. It allows the story to live beyond statistics, to breathe within the hearts of those who hear it. Because ultimately, The Final Minutes isn't just a story about a plane crash, it's a story about us. Our trust, our courage, our fear, and our need to understand the impossible. Facts tell us what happened in the sky that day. Emotion tells us why we'll never forget it. The investigation's final report closed one chapter, but not the story itself. Even as the ink dried on those pages, 1,000 questions floated between the lines. What really happened in those last seconds? Why did the readings contradict each other? Could any human being have done more? The facts were precise, the numbers were absolute. Yet the truth still seemed to drift just beyond reach, like light bending through deep water. Months later, engineers and scientists revisited the simulation rooms. Giant screens glowed in dim laboratories, while flight paths replayed again and again. Each time, the virtual aircraft reached the same point of failure, spiraling toward the same invisible wall of uncertainty. No matter how many equations they adjusted, or how carefully they reconstructed the sequence, there remained a few seconds that defied explanation. It was as though the event contained an emotional shadow that science could measure, but never quite illuminate. Documentary cameras captured these late-night moments, faces reflected in glass, hands gripping coffee mugs, the quiet hum of computers calculating fate. A narrator's voice floated through the imagery. Between logic and loss lies the space we call mystery. Those words resonated with viewers because they reflected the human condition itself, the need to understand what refuses to be fully known. Among the most haunting discoveries were the final data spikes, tiny fluctuations that showed the crew fighting until the very end. Even as alarms screamed and controls resisted, they never stopped correcting, never stopped communicating. The cold mathematics of pitch and roll angles revealed something astonishingly warm persistence. It became a factual monument to courage. Every number, every second logged, was a trace of human will refusing surrender. The emotional power of that discovery rippled outward. For families, those numbers became proof that their loved ones didn't simply vanish, they fought. For pilots, it was a reminder of their shared duty and silent brotherhood. For engineers, it was a call to make systems not just efficient but compassionate. Machines designed with empathy for the fallibility of the people who use them. In this way, emotion transformed fact into purpose. Years later, a new documentary revisited the crash with updated technology and newly released recordings. The film began with a long shot of the sea, endless and calm, then cut to the recovered cockpit audio. The narrator whispered, "What we know now is more than data. It's understanding." He explained the sensor failures, the flawed software logic, the procedural confusion that turned seconds into disaster. But every explanation was paired with a human face, a pilot's photograph, a family's tears, a rescuer's memory of pulling wreckage from the water. The blending of image and emotion allowed the audience to absorb technical truth without losing empathy. Scientists have a phrase, the emotional residue of evidence. It describes the feeling left behind when facts meet tragedy. The investigation into this crash became a perfect example. Charts, graphs, and test results carried weight, not only because they were accurate, but because they were tied to real voices, real lives. Data without emotion is sterile, emotion without data is chaos. Together, they form understanding. Even years after the event, the wreckage site remained a place of pilgrimage. Divers who returned to map the ocean floor spoke of an eerie stillness below. Objects lay preserved in silence, seat frames twisted like sculptures, fragments of fuselage glinting under the beams of underwater lights. Each discovery reignited the question, how could so much evidence still leave so much unknown? The documentaries captured this paradox with quiet reverence. They didn't dramatize, they observed. The camera lingered on bubbles rising to the surface, on the expression of divers removing their masks, half relief, half sorrow, facts recovered from the deep meta-emotions that refused to sink. In classrooms, instructors began to use the story not only to teach aerodynamics but also to teach empathy. Look at this chart, one professor would say, pointing to the descent curve. Now imagine the people behind it. Students fell silent. In that pause, they grasped the real lesson, that every line of data represents a heartbeat once lost. This merging of education and emotion ensured that the tragedy would produce not only knowledge, but humanity. The emotional gravity of the event also inspired technological change. New protocols were introduced, new sensors designed, new software coded to prevent misreadings. Each upgrade carried a trace of the voices from that cockpit. Engineers often said quietly, it was an unspoken acknowledgement that progress is sometimes written in pain. And so, the emotional side of the tragedy lived within the technical solutions, proof that even loss can lead to evolution. In later interviews, one investigator reflected, we kept thinking we were solving a puzzle, but what we were really doing was listening to a story. That story was not linear, it was layered, part science, part sorrow, part redemption. Blending facts with emotion allowed him to see the event not as an accident alone, but as a moment of profound human expression. The pilot's professionalism, the family's endurance, the rescuer's compassion, all became data points in the emotional landscape of truth. When the anniversary arrived again, television screens filled with archival footage. The narrator's tone softened. Time heals, he said, but mystery remains. The broadcast alternated between updated findings and personal reflections. A mother described the last message her son had sent before boarding. A systems analyst explained the new fail-safe designs derived from the crash. Each story complemented the other, the heart and the mind working together to preserve memory. Perhaps the most moving segment came near the end, when the film revisited the co-pilot's family. His daughter, now grown, stood beside the sea holding a tablet, displaying the simulation of the final flight. She watched the tiny digital plane descend, then whispered, "He was trying to bring them home." The statement was both fact and feeling, and that combination pierced deeper than any technical report could. After the credits, viewers lingered. Many described a strange mixture of sadness and respect, as if they had personally met the people involved. That is the goal of such storytelling, to create empathy through accuracy, to turn investigation into remembrance. Behind every mystery, there is always the temptation to explain everything, to reduce chaos into equations. Yet the enduring strength of the final minutes lies in its refusal to do so completely. It honors both the known and the unknowable. It teaches that emotion does not weaken fact, it completes it. Because when we understand only how something happened, we gain knowledge. When we understand why it matters, we gain wisdom. The last scene of the newest documentary returned once again to the sky. A plane ascended through clouds as the narrator spoke one final time. Every answer we find begins with a question written in loss, and every question, when faced with compassion, becomes light. The music faded, and the frame dissolved into blue. In that moment, the audience felt the convergence of all that had been learned, the science, the sorrow, the hope. Even now, the story continues to echo. Aviation experts still reference the case when discussing automation and human response. Psychologists cite it when exploring trauma and resilience. Artists paint it as a metaphor for the fragile balance between progress and humility. Each field finds its own reflection in the event, because the narrative bridges the two great languages of existence, reason and emotion. Long after the headlines disappeared, the emotional truth remained steady. It lives in the hearts of pilots who touch the controls with renewed reverence, in the eyes of families who find strength in remembrance, in the voices of narrators who retell the story so that its lessons are never lost. Blending fact with feeling turned tragedy into legacy. And so the journey of the final minutes never truly ends. The facts stay preserved in archives, coded in binary, printed in reports. The emotions live on in human memory, retold each time someone asks, "What really happened up there?" Both are necessary, both are sacred, for without facts, there is no understanding. Without emotion, there is no meaning. The ocean that once kept its secrets now holds a different kind of silence, one filled with respect. Ships still pass above, their radar pings echoing faintly through the depths. Perhaps somewhere in that darkness, a fragment of the aircraft rests undisturbed, carrying the final balance of what was known and what remains unsolved. When divers' lights pass over it, for a brief instant, knowledge and feeling converge again, and the story breathes once more. Because the truth of any great mystery is never complete. It shifts, it evolves, it invites us to listen. Facts guide us toward understanding, but emotion reminds us why we seek it. Together, they keep the memory alive, not as tragedy alone, but as a testament to the human spirit that continues to search the skies for answers, even when the clouds refuse to part. The sky was calm that morning, painted in soft shades of blue, the kind of day when flying feels effortless. Yet within that stillness, destiny was quietly waiting. Inside the cockpit, the crew moved with quiet precision, experienced hands guiding metal and wind in perfect harmony. Every switch flipped. Every phrase spoken over the radio carried the rhythm of training and trust. They had done this countless times before. But on this flight, routine would turn into history, and professionalism would become heroism in its purest form. As the aircraft climbed, nothing seemed unusual. The passengers settled into their seats, unaware that each heartbeat ticked closer to a moment that would test the limits of courage. The flight deck chatter remained calm, weather reports, coordinates, minor adjustments. Beneath that calm ran the invisible current of duty that defines every pilot, the unspoken vow to protect every soul on board, no matter what. When the first tremor appeared in the instruments, it was barely noticeable. A slight shudder, a flicker on the display. Then came the realization. Something was terribly wrong. The cockpit voice recorder captured the shift in tone, that subtle crack in certainty. Yet even as alarms sounded and warning lights glared red, the crew did not panic, they fought. Each command was clear, clipped, focused. Check rudder response. Stabilize pitch. Confirm system override. These weren't just words, they were lifelines thrown into chaos. The co-pilot's voice carried steady resolve, the captain's tone mixed authority with empathy. They knew the stakes, they knew the fear, but their professionalism formed a shield stronger than panic. Outside, the world continued to spin unaware. On radar screens miles away, controllers watched blips move across digital skies, not realizing one of them was descending faster than it should. Inside the cabin, passengers felt a vibration, then a jolt, the kind that steals the breath from your chest. But the intercom remained silent for a moment, not out of neglect but out of discipline. The crew was still trying, still believing they could bring the plane home. That silence, now preserved in history, became more chilling than any scream. It was the sound of human beings facing the impossible with composure. As altitude dropped, the captain made one final correction, pulling against a system that no longer obeyed. The co-pilot read the checklist aloud, his voice trembling slightly yet refusing to surrender. They knew every action mattered, even in those final seconds. There's something sacred about that kind of courage. The refusal to give up even when logic says the end is certain. The black box recorded their last exchange, a calm command, a final acknowledgement, then static. Silence followed, heavy and eternal. When investigators later played that recording, the room was motionless. No one spoke for minutes. They didn't just hear a disaster, they heard character, discipline, and love for duty. It wasn't merely a crash, it was a testament to professionalism under pressure. These men had stared into the face of death and chosen composure over chaos. The documentaries that followed would often replay those final minutes, pairing the mechanical data with haunting orchestral music. Viewers would watch as the cockpit recreations showed pilots gripping controls, instruments flashing, and through it all, the unbroken will to save lives. It was not dramatization, it was truth. A truth so profound that words felt small beside it. Experts later concluded that no human intervention could have altered the outcome. Yet what the crew did in those moments still mattered, because courage is not about victory, it's about how one meets the inevitable. Their composure gave investigators clarity, their decisions gave future pilots knowledge, and their final words gave the world a glimpse into the strength of human spirit at its breaking point. When families later heard how their loved ones fought till the end, something shifted in their grief. Pain turned into pride. They realized that even in tragedy, bravery can leave behind light. The captain's calm, the co-pilot's persistence, the flight attendant's quiet reassurance to passengers, they became symbols of the dignity that defines aviation's finest traditions. Today, when pilots train in simulators and instructors recount the event, they don't just teach procedures. They teach presence. Listen, they say, to the tone of those voices. That is what professionalism sounds like when time runs out. The silence that followed in the real cockpit still echoes through the corridors of flight schools, through memorials, through every takeoff that carries hope. Because in the end, bravery isn't loud. It's the quiet steadiness in a storm, the voice that refuses to break, the hands that keep working when every light is flashing red. In those final minutes, the crew of that doomed aircraft didn't lose control. They demonstrated what control truly means. And in that unspoken heroism lies the heart of the world's most mysterious plane crash, the moment when fear bowed to duty, and silence became the loudest proof of courage humanity can offer. The search began as the sun rose over a restless sea. Waves stretched endlessly, glinting under the morning light, as ships, helicopters, and satellites formed a silent armada of hope. What was once a routine flight path had become a coordinate of mystery. Radar screens showed nothing now, just open blue. Yet somewhere below that surface, hidden in darkness and depth, lay the fragments of truth. The world watched as search teams set out to find what had vanished so suddenly, and the haunting question echoed everywhere: how does something so large simply disappear? From the control rooms, investigators monitored grids on digital maps, dividing the ocean into endless sections. The hum of machines, the clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of experts, all carried a strange blend of determination and disbelief. At sea, crews leaned over rails, scanning the horizon for any sign: a floating seat cushion, a piece of fuselage, anything that could speak in the silence. Every discovery was treated like sacred evidence, a whisper from the deep that might explain what had gone wrong. The early days of the search were filled with tension. News channels broadcast live updates, satellites captured patches of debris that disappeared before ships could reach them. Each false lead chipped away at hope, yet no one dared to stop. The documentary footage from those days tells a story of exhaustion and obsession, the kind of relentless effort that defines humanity's refusal to accept the unknown. "We'll keep looking," one search leader said into a camera, his voice heavy with fatigue. Somewhere out there, the answers are waiting. Beneath the waves, remotely operated vehicles descended into the abyss. Their lights pierced the darkness, illuminating twisted metal, torn wiring, and fragments of a story no longer complete. The seafloor became a silent archive, preserving the moment of destruction in eerie stillness. Engineers on the surface watched the live feed in silence, their faces pale in the glow of monitors. "Stop there," one of them whispered. Zoom in. The image sharpened. Part of the tail section, numbers still visible. The search had found its first piece of truth. As days turned into weeks, the tone shifted from rescue to recovery. The word hope was replaced by evidence. Yet even in loss, the mission carried a strange nobility. Divers and specialists treated every fragment with reverence, as if handling the memory of those who had been aboard. One diver described it later. Down there, it doesn't feel like you're touching metal. It feels like you're touching time itself. The documentaries used his voice as narration, layered over slow shots of the underwater wreckage, each image heavy with both grief and revelation. The black boxes became the ultimate goal, the voice and data recorders that held the final answers. Finding them was like chasing ghosts through a maze of pressure and darkness. Days passed with no signal, no sound. Then a faint ping was detected. The ship's crew froze. Could it be? Instruments recalibrated, and the signal grew stronger. The cameras captured the moment, faces tense, eyes wide, hope returning like a forgotten heartbeat. Hours later, the robot arm surfaced, carrying a battered orange cylinder streaked with rust and salt. Applause broke out, not for victory but for discovery. In the investigation labs, technicians carefully opened the device. The room was silent except for the click of tools. Inside that metal casing lay voices, the last human sounds from the flight. When the data was finally played, time seemed to stop. The transcript revealed calm professionalism, desperate calculation, and then silence. Facts were emerging, but they carried an unbearable emotional weight. The documentaries didn't sensationalize this moment, they let it breathe. Viewers could hear the real recordings, followed by the soft hum of ocean footage. A reminder that answers often come wrapped in sorrow. Once the evidence was assembled, the story began to take shape. Engineers reconstructed the sequence of events, matching data to debris, and piece by piece, the puzzle began to speak. Yet even then, the mystery didn't fully fade. There were moments no data could explain, decisions made in seconds, reactions born of instinct. The documentaries balanced this duality with care, the science of investigation and the emotion of remembrance. One investigator said it best: "We may find what happened, but we'll never fully understand why it had to." As months passed, the site of the crash turned into a place of remembrance. Families were invited to visit the ocean, to lay flowers upon the water. The camera panned slowly over faces, tears blending with sea spray, and the narration whispered, "Sometimes the search doesn't end with discovery. It ends with peace." Those moments reminded the world that behind every mystery lies humanity's greatest strength, the will to keep searching, not just for truth, but for closure. The final scenes of the documentary fade with the image of the ocean, calm once more, holding its secrets. A voice speaks softly. "On every investigation we seek facts, but in every loss we seek meaning. The search continues not for wreckage, but for understanding." And as the screen fades to black, the message lingers that even in the darkest depths, the human spirit never stops listening for the echoes of truth. Night had fallen when the world finally paused to reflect on what had happened. The investigations had ended, reports were filed, and theories had been debated, yet something still lingered, something that no document could explain. The sixth layer of this story was not about data or design, but about memory, how humanity absorbs tragedy and transforms it into lessons, remembrance, and resilience. The final minutes was no longer just a mystery to solve, it had become a mirror, reflecting the fragility and strength that coexist within every flight, every journey, every human story suspended between sky and earth. The documentary begins with silence, footage of empty runways glistening under rain, engines cooling in the dark, and a distant echo of jet noise fading into nothing. The narrator's voice breaks the stillness. "When the sky takes, it never forgets." Those words capture the emotion that statistics cannot measure. Across the world, families still light candles, pilots still glance at instruments with renewed vigilance, and investigators still whisper to themselves before pressing play on recovered recordings. The crash may be history, but its echoes live on in every takeoff that follows. In a quiet home, a mother keeps her son's flight badge in a glass frame. She runs her fingers along the engraved name, whispering, "You kept them calm." That single sentence holds more weight than any headline. It is the essence of remembrance, not a grand monument, but a quiet devotion that turns grief into strength. Documentary cameras capture these moments with humility, no music, no commentary, just the sound of wind brushing through curtains and a photo illuminated by morning light. It is through such intimacy that the audience begins to understand the real cost of aviation's mysteries. For those in the aviation world, this tragedy became an unspoken teacher. Pilots trained with deeper concentration, safety briefings gained new urgency, engineers revisited old assumptions. In flight schools, instructors replay the event not to haunt but to prepare. "You see this?" one says, pointing to the radar replay. "This is what professionalism looks like in chaos." The documentary blends these training scenes with interviews from experts who speak not with fear, but with reverence. "Every accident teaches us," says one investigator. "Every life lost pushes aviation a step closer to safety." In that way, remembrance transforms into progress, but beyond the hangars and control rooms, the emotional weight remains. Journalists who covered the story still recall the long nights waiting for updates, the empty terminals filled with anxious faces. Divers still remember the cold touch of the ocean, the eerie quiet that enveloped them as they reached the wreckage. "It felt like time had stopped down there," one of them recalls. "Like the world above had moved on, but the moment of impact was still frozen beneath us." The documentary overlays his voice with underwater footage, lights gliding over twisted metal, currents weaving through silence. Viewers can feel it, the haunting peace of places where human tragedy has settled into the seabed. Years later, new generations watch the film not as witnesses, but as inheritors of its lessons. To them, the final minutes is more than history. It's a reminder of the price of progress. The narrator explains, each system improved, each policy rewritten carries within it a name, a face, a voice. The music swells not in sorrow but in gratitude. Humanity has a strange gift. It can turn disaster into wisdom, pain into purpose. That transformation is what keeps the skies safe today. The emotional resonance of this event also inspired artists, poets, and filmmakers. Paintings depict clouds dissolving into light, symbolizing the souls that never returned. Songs were written, soft, reflective melodies that speak of courage and farewell. These creative tributes carry the story beyond aviation, turning it into something universal. The documentary closes with snippets of these works, blending them with real cockpit recordings, reminding us that memory is not just held in archives but in hearts. In one powerful scene, the narrator walks through a museum dedicated to air disasters. Beneath glass cases lie fragments of the aircraft, metal twisted by impact, instruments frozen mid-measure. A plaque reads, "Each part tells a story of effort, not error." That sentiment defines the legacy of this mystery. The pilot's bravery, the rescuer's persistence, the investigator's dedication, all represent the light that emerges from darkness. The camera lingers on the exhibit, and for a long moment, no words are needed. The silence itself speaks volumes. The final act of remembrance happens at the ocean, the crash site marked only by coordinates. A memorial service gathers families, rescuers, and officials. Flowers are cast upon the water, drifting slowly across the waves. The narrator's voice returns, gentle yet resolute. The sea keeps its secrets, but it also carries our love. The music fades into the natural sound of waves, seagulls, and wind, a reminder that nature holds tragedy and healing in the same breath. As the documentary draws to a close, the sky turns gold with the rising sun. A plane passes overhead, its vapor trail glowing like a ribbon of hope. The narrator ends with words that feel both final and eternal. Every mystery begins in darkness, but every answer, no matter how small, is a light. We search, we remember, and through remembrance, we rise again. The screen fades to black, but the feeling remains. an ache mixed with awe, a quiet understanding that the story of the final minutes is not just about loss, but about legacy. It is about how humanity chooses to respond when faced with the unexplainable. Not with despair, but with determination. Not with fear, but with remembrance. And in that remembrance the mystery lives on, not as tragedy alone, but as proof that even in our most fragile moments, we never stop reaching for the light. The final keynote brings the story full circle. The return from mystery to meaning, from loss to legacy. The Final Minutes is more than an investigation. It is a reflection of the human spirit's endless pursuit of understanding. As the documentary enters its closing chapter, the tone shifts, not toward despair, but toward reverence. The screen fades from black to a slow sunrise above the clouds. The narrator's voice, calm yet resonant, breaks the silence. Every ending leaves behind a beginning. From the wreckage, from the silence, from the final minutes, new lessons take flight. Across control towers and training centers, the echoes of the tragedy continue to shape the present. Pilots brief their crews with deeper attention. Engineers test every system twice. Air traffic controllers watch their screens not as operators, but as guardians. The voice of experience hums beneath every procedure now, reminding them that the smallest signal, the faintest alarm, can mean the difference between routine and catastrophe. These are not merely precautions, they are promises made in remembrance. The documentary captures this change through real-life scenes, pilots preparing for flight, technicians running diagnostics, the quiet tension before takeoff. Every image radiates respect for those lost and for the lessons they left behind. But beyond the realm of aviation, the story transcends into something even more universal. It becomes about humanity's relationship with uncertainty, how we search for meaning in the unknown. In interviews, psychologists explain that tragedies like these remind us of our shared vulnerability, but also of our shared resilience. What cannot control the sky, one expert says softly, but we can control how we rise after it breaks us. That sentiment flows through the film like an invisible current. It is the heart of the seventh keynote, the transformation of tragedy into wisdom. The film revisits the faces we met earlier, the investigators who refused to give up, the families who turned grief into advocacy, the survivors of related incidents who found courage in others' stories. One scene shows a mother speaking at a memorial. "My son's story doesn't end with the crash. It continues every time someone lands safely." Her words cut through the air like light breaking through clouds. The audience feels it, that unspoken connection between pain and progress. The camera lingers on her face, then slowly pans upward to the open sky, where the reflection of sunlight looks almost like a spirit rising. In a moving montage, the documentary weaves together images of planes taking off, engineers working on new safety systems, and children watching the sky with wonder. The narrator explains, every mystery solved, every technology improved, every precaution taken. These are the voices of those we lost, speaking through our progress. It's a poetic truth. The world keeps moving, but it carries with it the memory of those who could not. The deeper message unfolds gently, that even the most painful events can lead to something greater. The crash that once defined tragedy now defines transformation. Aviation became safer, communication became clearer, and the global network of investigators grew stronger, bound by the will to never let history repeat itself. The facts of the event remain fixed, but their meaning continues to evolve. Each documentary retelling, each anniversary, each small act of remembrance adds another layer to the legacy. There's a quiet scene near the end, a flight simulator glowing in a dark training room. A young pilot sits inside, eyes focused, hands steady on the controls. On the screen, the weather turns turbulent, the alarms sound, the familiar crisis scenario begins. But this time, he responds faster, calmer, wiser. Behind the glass, an instructor nods. The documentary narrator says, "Knowledge is not born from perfection. It is born from mistakes paid for with courage." That moment captures the essence of the final keynote. the cycle of learning that turns sorrow into strength. The closing minutes of the film bring us back to the ocean, the eternal witness. The waves move softly, reflecting stars that shimmer like fragments of memory. A soft voice recites the names of those lost, one by one. While violins rise in the background, the camera pulls back, revealing the vastness of the sea, then slowly tilts upward toward the heavens. The final minutes, the narrator says, belong to the past. But the lessons they gave us belong to the future. The credits roll, but the documentary doesn't end with closure. It ends with continuation. Viewers sit in silence, some with tears, some with awe, all with reflection. The film's message lingers, that every mystery, no matter how dark, eventually points toward light. And in that light, we find not just the story of a crash, but the story of us all, our fragility, our determination, our unbreakable need to understand. In the end, The Final Minutes is not a film about tragedy, it is a film about legacy. It shows how the human race, even in its most broken moments, keeps moving forward, not forgetting, not surrendering, but transforming. The final image is simple yet profound. A new aircraft ascending through clouds, its wings catching the first light of dawn. The narrator whispers one last line: we remember, we learn, and we fly again. And as the music fades, the viewer is left with the quiet realization that perhaps the real mystery was never in the sky. It was always within us, how, against every silence, every shadow, and every fall, humanity still dares to rise.